Hi everyone, we're here waiting on Jonathan Rajewski. We're going to be doing a live studio visit with him, and he's out in Detroit getting ready for his solo exhibition with us. I'm at my house today, which is a little different than in the past. And as soon as he hops on here, we'll start taking a look around and talking to him about what he's got going on. See if I can find him on here. And just so everyone knows, we're also archiving all of these talks up on oh, hi Jonathan, you're here. Let's add you in. Saying we are archiving all of these talks on a newly created YouTube page. Hey buddy.
Hey.
It's so good to see your face.
You too. Last time I saw you, I had no hair. I had shaved my head, I think. So it's been this long. This is how long it's been.
Needless to say, you've had a lot going on in the past couple of months since I last saw you.
Yeah. I think a lot of people.
So is this your first IG Live experience during the COVID?
This is my first IG Live ever, yeah.
All right.
I've done some video chat, video stuff since, like Zoom and FaceTime with family, but not this.
Yeah. And you're back in your kind of famous Detroit studio where we've actually gotten to visit you in person, not just myself, but with a whole group of Miamians. We invaded you.
Yeah, I think you've been here twice, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm back here. So, I don't even know where the story begins. It's a long story, I think. But when the virus hit, everything closed down, of course, including graduate school. So when graduate school, I'm trying to figure out a good way to hold this phone. My face
That's
is like,
cool.
You have yours.
It's good if we can see more of you. There you go. That's perfect.
I'll sit behind. Yeah. So graduate school closed down, which meant that our studios were unavailable to us, and I had already come back to Detroit for the recess. And so once everything had gotten worse, I just never went back to Connecticut. So, my car is there, my clothes are there.
Yeah.
I came here with a suitcase, and so I have my suitcase of stuff.
So I'm just going to fill everyone in on like a little bit of background info. So whoever is just joining us, this is Jonathan Rajewski joining us live from his studio in Detroit. Jonathan's first solo exhibition at the gallery is scheduled to open on May 22nd. And we had been planning the show for maybe over a year. How long? I mean, it's been a minute.
Yeah, I think I was in Miami in June.
Yeah, so we've been planning the show at least for that long. And you are supposed to be or wrapping up your first year of the graduate program at Yale. And when this all started, we had connected, and I just checked in to make sure you knew the show was still happening, sort of come hell or high water. And we both made the decision of saying, let's leave the work in the studio. It'll be fine. By the time May rolls around, no big deal. We'll be able to snatch it up and bring it down to Miami. And then why don't you tell everyone what happened? Oh, wait, I just have to shout out really quickly our dear friend, Alexa Woolman, who is never on Instagram, just joined us live. So I just want to tell her I'm really proud of her for logging in and making this happen.
Welcome to the chat room.
Welcome to the chat room. All right, go ahead, Jonathan. So pick up where you left off.
Well, I think, we had I think we thought that this was going to last like a week or two, and that the work would be, I'd be able to rescue it from the studio. and that didn't happen. And instead of like trying to organize like some really complicated gymnastic shipping arrangement to get the work from Connecticut to Detroit and then to Miami, it just made more sense to me to just sort of make work in the present moment, within these circumstances, and just let just whatever happens happens. And so that's what's happening right now. I mean, so everyone that's here, I had an entirely different show that's sitting in New Haven, Connecticut. And it's kind of funny to think about. It's basically finished. I mean, I had spent the last 4 or 5 months working on those paintings, and then, they shut the studios down, so I can't get that work out. And it's interesting to think about, like, having to just let that go and just, start over again. And in a way, it's been really exciting, because I wouldn't want to make work in any other moment than in that sort of in these present circumstances. And so to have made these other paintings between October and February, and then just sort of like take them out of that like hermetically sealed period of time and then just drop them into the period of, the coronavirus moment, it just felt like sort of strange.
Yeah. It's really interesting because in talking about your show, so I want to give everyone a little bit of background about you and how I got to know your work. So we were actually introduced by Alex Gartenfeld. The first time, my father is from Detroit, and so I had been there many times, but never under the guise of an art visit. And so several years ago, I went out there, and Alex said, "You got to visit with Jonathan." And at the time, your work was really more kind of about social practice and really activist, which I think is so interesting to kind of come around to your show happening now during this moment. And also to you being, I was thinking about you last night watching the news, because they were showing, all these crazy images of people protesting the stay-at-home order. And, Michigan is the third worst state in the country for infections. And really, our show was not going to have much to do anything with activism or politics, or it was really about you kind of being in this more entrenched space inside your own head. So maybe you could tell everyone a little bit about what you were doing when we first met, and the work that you were making at Yale, and then where you're at now. I know that's like a huge kind of spectrum to cover, but I'll jump in if it's necessary.
No, I think to clarify, I've never thought of myself as working within social practice. I think that I've always maintained that there's a very big difference between the work that I do as an activist, or the work that I was doing and continue to do in the prisons. I think that there's a very big difference there than the work that I make as a painter. And I think that like there's a lot of problems with social practice, and so the work that I was doing when we met, and the work that I'm still involved with, was with the Hamtramck Free School, which was a sort of rhizomatic alternative pedagogical program that offered free educational initiatives both outside and inside prisons throughout the state of Michigan. And for me, that was something that I tried to the best of my ability to sort of separate some of those tentacles of my life from the paintings. Although I was going into those prisons as a arts educator, like working within poetry and visual art. So there's certainly overlap. It's like a Venn diagram probably. But I think that for me, I've always been really skeptical of social practice artists and their projects, because I think that oftentimes there's a lot of, they use empty signifiers like community and outreach, and those the impact of those projects are questionable, and also questionable insofar as who they're impacting. And so I've just always thought, like, at what point is artists working within politics actually just activists? You know, and activists don't get, you know, generally speaking, you know, activists don't you know, they don't get exhibitions at the Hirshhorn or something, you know.
Totally.
Uh,
Totally.
but artists do, you know, artists are and should and can be political, and that's a whole long conversation I'd like to have.
I think for me, it was really interesting to come to your work under the guise of the Hamtramck Free School, and then come to your studio and find this whole other practice that was completely divorced from those things. And I think that, you know, it's definitely the idea of, you know, I kind of always question the idea of like effectiveness, you know, like you're talking about how, you know, how one thing gets to get called the other, how it's funded, or sort of how it's supported in its own network. And I think oftentimes, you know, it's a question of if this thing that you're making in the very insular art world is meant to reach or affect a mass audience or a mass population, you know, how are you doing that in this world? And so I always like this, and I think when you said the Venn diagram, it's kind of a perfect description of your sort of many worlds that obviously inform one another, but also each speak to their kind of most effective audiences. So you kind of, you know, took this time for yourself to go to grad school and develop your, what is a very kind of material, almost expressionist practice. So tell us a little bit about that and the kind of objects that you were making when you applied and that you've been making since.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange, you know, everything's very surreal these days, but you know, it was also like very strange for me to go to grad school, because I went to undergrad. I graduated from undergrad 10 years ago, and I studied philosophy, and I you know, I got involved with alternative educational models. And so I still maintain that you do not need to get an MFA. You do not need to go to art school. That, you know, everyone has the capacity to be an artist autodidactically, you know, find mentors in your neighborhood or in your community, work, you know, like learn the regional work that's around you, participate in it. You don't have to go to grad school. And in a lot of ways, it's very contradictory for me to be going to grad school. You disappeared. Oh, there
I'm
you
here. I'm back.
go. You know, in some ways, it's like, you know, it's contradictory for me to go to grad school when I you know, helped found this alternative free school. I will just say that, you know, my reasons for going to grad school were personal, and it was that, you know, I've been in Detroit for 10 years. It's relatively a small creative, it's a huge creative community, but there aren't a lot of creative employment opportunities. And so, you know, I thought going to graduate school would allow me to have maybe a greater opportunity to teach specifically, because I do enjoy teaching. But I say, like, you know, I use that word really in a fuzzy way, because I also am like I kind of antagonistically have a reaction against teaching as well, like in a sort of sophist way. I think, you know, I think of us all as like teacher students, you know, as like, as learners. And so I also really, you know, strongly question the, you know, the framework of how we, you know, share knowledge, and how we receive knowledge. And I think that I have a much more fluid feeling about education, and that it doesn't need to be art school. So I just think it's important for me to say that because I don't know, in some ways, some days I don't know how and why and all of that, but that's fine. But so yeah, I applied to graduate school. I'm in graduate school. I'm finishing my first year of school.
And you mostly, I just want to interject to say that you mostly applied to graduate school with a series of kind of grid paintings, right? These sort of abstract.
I did, yeah. In fact, I could even show one of the. I happen to like. So I just moved back into the studio, and this is a studio that I moved into. Here, I'll wait. I moved into the studio here in 2012. And so I've actually been in the studio for 8 years, and I just temporarily moved out when I went to um, New Haven, and I was renting the studio out to my friend Jim Shatlin and John Maggie, and then because of the virus and everything shut down, I was able to slip back in here, which is really perfect right now because the show's coming up.
Because you have to make an entire show in 6 weeks.
Yes. But one of those grid paintings that you're referring to is this one over here. So this was kind of what I was doing. I'm like taking out all the old paintings, but this was one of the older. This was one of the paintings that I had. I was working in grids at the time.
Can you get up close to? Oh, your dog! I know that dog. What's up?
This is my emotional support animal.
Oh man, I feel like I'm having a flashback to this to like a year ago in Detroit, a year and change ago in Detroit. So show us, Jonathan, can you get close to the grid painting and show us some of the texture on the surface?
All right, let's see if I can. All right. So this is, I think, from late 2018, early 2019. And it's a lot of different materials. So there's some quilt material, some flowers from my wedding are in here. Those are some wedding flowers. Hey, Johnny. Oil pastel, acrylic. There's a rag up here.
And so the process of these works was really quite intuitive. Like I remember you talking to us about assembling materials and kind of putting these things together in a way that to me feels very close to the spheres. So I think maybe if you want to jump into telling us what you've been working on. I mean, obviously you don't have the work to show us, but tell us a little bit about how the work has evolved since you've been at school, and then we can start to look at some of the objects that are going to be in the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I think like with this painting, started with textile material, and so there's some kind of like almost looks like a crossword puzzle, but it's this kind of quilted fabric material. And so that was placed first, and then the textile sort of informed those subsequent decisions of color. So there's like an initial placement of material, and then the material sort of steers the painting. And I wanted it to be a sort of wonky grid. I didn't want it to look like a tight kind of grid. I wanted it to be sort of flaccid, and I sort of this painting is called Flaccid Geometry, because I was kind of interested in the sort of rigidity of geometric abstraction and then geometry itself, but sort of like bending it a little bit and just making it just slightly off. And I think in the same way that starting with the material and allowing the material to guide other decisions has been a sort of base level operation for me, that I kind of move through, everything with. So I don't usually start with a drawing. I don't usually, hey, Jose, hey, Ed, hey, Tim. I don't usually start with a with a drawing. I sort of just work, and then I work through as I go. And so a lot of times the paintings get painted over and over and over again. This one happened, you know, I don't think there was another painting under this painting. I think that this was the only one. But I think, so these are the two that I've been working on today and yesterday. And these are dots. They're spheres, they're orbs, they're stars, they're points, they're balls, they're, it's pointillistic, it's drippy. And in the same way that, you know, the grid, colors of the grid inform the other subsequent colors. And so, you know, the red might, you know, it's sort of like, especially for those of us in this chat room that are working as artists and working in color, there's a very tangible, you know, reactive moment with color where you kind of can sense like, okay, this is the color that has to go next to this color. And those are decisions that are made like in the process of working for me. They don't happen ahead of time. And you know, the colors, I'm a really sloppy painter, so I don't really mix things very well. And like, this is like a palette, you know, just like, maybe other people do this, but I'm really not organized. And you know, the floor is like an indication of that. And I think, so like some of the muddiness happens just because I'm negligent with washing brushes, and so the color decisions as well are based on that kind of just way of painting as well.
There's something about these works that remind me a little bit of a garden, you know, and this, I've been thinking about it with the spheres predominantly because we chose to use that one with the flower in it for the press release and the supporting material for the show.
This one here.
Oh, interesting. Well, I was thinking of the grids and the dots. I hadn't seen that other painting, but
which flower painting?
I was just saying the flower sphere, the sphere that we used for the press release.
Oh, okay, yeah. I don't know if I can find it. It's in here somewhere. Well, so no, this is a flower. This is a painting of flowers, and it's there's a couple of actual flowers in it too. But
I just read Michael Pollan's book on gardening, and he kind of talks about our relationship to nature as being flawed in the sense that we like to think of nature as something that's undisturbed, that we don't have to tend to, you know, so it's sort of like a preserve should just be on its own and never be touched. But in actuality, we do sort of the natural world a better service when we tend to it, you know, and that if we broadened our view of what a garden was, we could have a more kind of holistic relationship to the natural world where we understood ourselves as caretakers. And I think with the paintings that you were showing and kind of talking about the muddiness and your relationship to color and the responsiveness, there is, you know, a sense of letting go, but also intervening. And I think that that's a really good place to start to talk about the spheres, like where the spheres came from.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember where the spheres started. I mean, I think like, I'm gonna set the phone down for this one. You know, part of what's been going on for me over the last, you know, before I came to, you know, I think moving in general is very disruptive for me. I'm a creature of habit. And so as a creature of habit who goes to the same coffee shop every day and does generally the same, like you could kind of find me pretty easily if you had any kind of basic understanding of my daily routine. And I think that happens sometimes with paintings, even though they're never the same. but I think when I moved to Connecticut, there was a very disruptive thing that had happened, and I started to think maybe in simpler terms about making, both object making and painting. And earlier in the year, I started just wanting to work with lines and working with sort of returning to like sort of the fundamental principles of drawing or making or sculpting, or for me, I take that to be the line. That the line is kind of like the first thing that happens, and you can take that for however you want. But for me, it's just like sort of the existential mark of the line and what it in and of itself it can do. And so like a good example for me of that would be like Richard Tuttle's, wall line drawings. My dog is very interested in all these spheres. She's constantly like sniffing them.
Tell her to leave my show alone. We can't afford any. We can't afford any more disruption.
A lot of those spheres are made out of food items like sweet potatoes and beet skins and other things, and she hasn't eaten anything yet. But so it's like the Tuttle line drawings or something. I get really excited about, where he took a wire and he pinned it to the wall, and then he tried to trace the line. I think with the shadow of the line, I can't remember, but he couldn't do it, and he wanted to emphasize the sort of like inability to, for the human hand to retrace something like a bent wire, that there was a disconnect there, and there was something poetic in that disconnect. And so I realized that there was like a lot of poetic material in just something as simple as a line, like a concrete line in the floor or a crack in the wall. I've been spending a lot of time with this book, The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard, and there's a part in there where he quotes Leonardo da Vinci as like saying, if you need inspiration, like look at the crack in the wall, because inside that crack is an entire universe. And I think that book is a really incredible text, especially right now, considering we're all kind of stuck in our houses. And, there's a lot of jokes being made right now about like, how tired that we are of being in our houses. And I mean, there's like, this is really messed up time for a lot of people. But I still think that there's a lot of untapped poetic power, energy, excitement in the domestic space. The corners of the rooms, the ceilings. I think to spend a little more time with the architecture that we live in is an exciting thing for us to think about, maybe. So this is, a lot of this is born out of the fact that, Katie and I are having a baby, and we're going to be parents in like 8 or 9 weeks or something. And it's really exciting. And I think that knowing that there's all this circumstantial energy around me, like the impending fatherhood, the displacement from graduate school, the removal of the norms that I've been so familiar with, the general daily routine being upended, the uncertainty, the unemployment, etc. These sorts of things are the kind of causal engines for me to make simpler work, and to think more simply. And I think that's where some of the line work that I was doing earlier in the year comes from, which I can't show you anything of, but it led to the sphere. And I think the sphere is like sort of a nice follow-up from the line. And the sphere is basically like a kind of primal or primordial thing. I mean, the universe is made of spheres. A molecule is spherical, the planet is spherical. We use the stars to navigate. Those stars are spherical, stars are spherical, blood cells are spherical, coronavirus is spherical. Everything is basically round. And in that text, there's a chapter called The Phenomenology of Roundness. And I actually had been making these spheres for a while before I discovered that chapter. It was like a happy accident that chapter was in the book. But it's a really wonderful coincidence because there's a lot of there's a lot of great content in that chapter. I'd be happy if anyone wants to message me after this on here. I'll send you a PDF of the book. I think it's especially a great book to think about while we're all in, isolation. And so this first sphere started from a line, and the line was just strands of fabric that were on the floor in my studio. And when I became really focused on lines and the simplification of material, I started to become really aware of everything, like the crack, the edge of a wall, just the way that architecture, the subtleties in architecture, and also the things that people drop on the ground. And these became more and more exciting for me as material. And so I started to collect all these strands of fibers, which were, essentially lines. They're basically lines on the ground that are chance lines. They're like chance operations. And to collect all those materials and to like sphere them. And I didn't think about it at the time, but I do think that there's something gestational for me about this sphering, that in the way that like my wife is pregnant and we're having this baby and this is this formation, that somehow that the process of sphering for me is like my own idiosyncratic way of dealing or working through this new world that I'm in.
It's also the sort of triptych, we have Elsa Hansen Oldham show up. It's called Trinity. And that show was very much about her creating this body of work in her first year of motherhood, and in her and her husband becoming 3 people instead of 2. And, in the chat that she did with Tom Healy, he talked about the sort of principle of 3, right? That like all 3 just feels better. Perfect things come in 3s. The idea of like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, like everything is a triptych. And I think when you're a new parent, that, not only the idea of a sphere, like physically, right? Your body, not your body, but your wife's body becomes a sphere. But you also turn inward, and the idea of gestating not only the baby, but the space and the rooms in which the baby will be. And all of this is like an inward focus. And to have that happen at a time when our whole world has turned inward is really incredible, and I think it's so telling that you were already kind of working from what feels to me like an intuitive place of making these objects, of just like, it's kind of like the first art thing that a kid does is like take a ball of clay, take a piece of clay and like turn it into a ball. So you're out there in Yale kind of like craving something stable or like home feeling, and you start making these spheres out of stuff in the studio, like returning, kind of pulling the line back into itself.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's I think there are so many reasons why I came to this, and for me it's a really meditative thing to do. There's a really great Charles Ray talk that I watched yesterday. I spend a lot of time lately watching YouTube videos of artist talks. And I guess since I'll plug a couple of really good ones. If anyone's excited about good ones, there's a really nice one by Terry Winters on drawing at the Menil Foundation, and I really recommend that one. I really recommend the Amy Silman talk that Amy Silman gives at the Whitney. She talks about how paint is like, talks about the weight of paint as a material, paint as a material. But then there's a Charles Ray one. And I'd never seen Charles Ray give a lecture before or even know what Charles Ray looked like until yesterday when I saw him on YouTube. But he talks about sculpture and sculpting and this childlike tendency that we all have to sculpt at a young age, and how sphering or just lumping clay together is something that we all do at a young, generally we all do that. We all form balls or make snowballs, or, you know, we're in Michigan. It's actually snowing right now.
Oh
Sorry,
my.
I forgot. Yeah, this is what's happening outside right now. It's terrible.
Oh man. And you should, and to think you should be in Miami.
Yeah, look at this. I'm supposed to be in Miami. But
So show us some of these spheres, will you?
yeah, so the first, I was gonna see if I could find the first one.
I'm just going to ask too, Jonathan, because I can't see the time on my phone. If somebody can just give us a time check in the chat box, because I think this thing cuts off at exactly an hour, and I want to make sure we don't get cut short.
It's 1:36.
Okay, awesome.
So these are the spheres. Right now, there's about 500 of them, and I don't know if I can find the first one. Oh yeah, here it is. So this is the first one that I was talking about, which was all the fibers from my studio. And so in considering the line and thinking about all those things, that kind of condensing the aggregate material, you know, just like finding the things and then putting them into a sphere. This is one made out of gumball pod seeds.
That's great.
Some sheet music. This isn't, I don't know yet how this is going to look in the space. Thinking about that now. It's in a grid right now.
So this is an interesting thing too that I should mention to everyone is when the spheres were always part of the show, you know, pre-COVID.